The wagon lurched violently as another wheel hit a deep rut in the prairie trail. Sarah clutched the wooden side rail, her knuckles white beneath the dust that coated everything. She was 23 years old and had never known fear like this. Behind her, the canvas cover flapped wildly in the wind that seemed determined to tear their small caravan apart. 3 wagons had left Independence, Missouri, 6 weeks ago. Now only hers remained, and even that felt like a temporary mercy. Her uncle drove the team with grim determination, his face set in hard lines that had grown deeper with each passing mile. Aunt Martha sat beside him, silent and pale, clutching a Bible that offered little comfort against the reality of their situation. They had ignored every warning. The settlers at Fort Laramie had told them to wait, to join a larger group heading west. But Uncle Thomas was a stubborn man who believed his will could bend the world to his vision. That stubbornness had already cost them dearly. The Johnsons had turned back after crossing the North Platte, their youngest child burning with fever. The Hendersons had made it another week before their wagon axle cracked beyond repair. They had transferred what supplies they could and headed back on horseback, faces haunted by the knowledge that winter would catch them before they reached safety. Now the Morrison wagon rolled alone across an endless ocean of grass, heading toward mountains that seemed to grow no closer despite days of travel. Sarah had not wanted to come. She had a position as a school teacher in Philadelphia, a small room of her own, and prospects of a decent marriage to a banker's clerk. But her mother had died the previous winter, and her father had drunk himself into an early grave by spring. Uncle Thomas had appeared at the boarding house with his plans for Oregon and his certainty that family belonged together. He spoke of rich soil and opportunity, of starting fresh where the past could not follow. Sarah had packed her trunk because she had nowhere else to go, not because she believed in his dream. The wind shifted, bringing with it a smell that made her stomach clench. Smoke. Not the clean smoke of a campfire, but something thicker, more ominous. Uncle Thomas pulled the horses to a stop, standing up in the driver's seat to scan the horizon. Sarah followed his gaze and felt her heart drop into her boots. To the north, a dark smudge stained the sky. To the south, another. They were caught between 2 prairie fires, and the wind was pushing both toward them. Thomas, Aunt Martha whispered, the first word she had spoken in hours. Her husband did not answer. He was calculating distances, wind speed, the time it would take to outrun flames that could move faster than horses. Sarah watched his face and knew the answer before he spoke. They could not outrun this. The nearest river was miles away, and between them and safety lay ground so dry it would ignite like kindling. Uncle Thomas made his decision with the swift brutality of a man who had run out of choices. He turned the wagon east, away from Oregon, away from his dreams, toward a line of rocky hills that might offer shelter. The horses sensed his urgency and broke into a gallop without being urged. The wagon bounced and shuddered, threatening to shake apart. Sarah held on, tasting dust and fear, watching the smoke grow thicker on both sides. They did not see the riders until it was too late. One moment the prairie was empty except for grass and sky and the approaching wall of smoke. The next, warriors appeared as if materializing from the earth itself. They wore paint and leather, carried weapons that caught the strange orange light filtering through the smoke. There were perhaps 20 of them, sitting on horses that stood perfectly still despite the chaos of wind and fire and the panicked team pulling the Morrison wagon. Uncle Thomas hauled back on the reins so hard that Sarah was thrown forward. She caught herself against the seat back, her breath coming in gasps. The wagon stopped. The riders waited. And Sarah understood, with a clarity that cut through her terror, that whatever happened next would determine whether she lived or died. The prairie fire roared closer, and the warriors did not move, and time seemed to hang suspended in that smoke-darkened afternoon like a held breath waiting to be released. The lead rider urged his horse forward with barely perceptible pressure. He was tall, lean, with features carved from bronze and eyes that missed nothing. He wore his authority like other men wore clothes, a natural part of his being that required no announcement. 2 eagle feathers hung from his long black hair, moving gently in the hot wind. His bare chest bore scars that spoke of battles survived, and around his neck hung a necklace of bear claws. Sarah had never seen anyone more terrifying or more magnificent. He spoke in Lakota, his voice deep and controlled. Uncle Thomas shook his head, made gestures that indicated he did not understand. The warrior switched to another language, then another. Finally, he spoke in broken English, each word carefully formed. Fire comes. You die here. It was not a threat but a statement of fact, delivered with the casual certainty of someone observing the weather. He gestured toward the smoke, now thick enough to make Sarah's eyes water. The roar of the flames was audible, a sound like distant thunder that grew steadily louder. We mean no harm, Uncle Thomas said, his voice higher than usual. "We're just passing through, heading to Oregon Territory." The words sounded foolish even as he spoke them. Geography and destination meant nothing with fire bearing down on all of them. The warrior's expression did not change. He looked at Uncle Thomas, at Aunt Martha, and then his gaze settled on Sarah. She felt pinned by that look, examined and assessed in a way that made her want to hide and stand straighter simultaneously. The warrior spoke rapidly to his companions. Several responded, their tones suggesting disagreement. An argument developed, conducted in voices that remained level despite the urgency of their situation. Sarah understood none of the words but grasped the fundamental tension. Some wanted to leave the white travelers to their fate. Others advocated for a different course. The lead warrior listened to all sides, then made a decision with a single sharp gesture that silenced all debate. He turned back to the wagon and spoke directly to Sarah, ignoring her uncle entirely. "You come. Now. Leave wagon." His English was limited, but his meaning was crystal clear. Sarah looked at her uncle, whose face had gone from pale to red. "Absolutely not," Thomas said, his voice shaking with outrage and fear. "We will not abandon our possessions to a band of savages. We'll take our chances with the fire." The warrior's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been contempt or might have been pity. He spoke again, slower this time, as if addressing a child. "Horses faster than wagon. Fire faster than both. Choose." The mathematics of survival could not have been stated more plainly. Sarah felt the heat now, carried on the wind along with ash that fell like gray snow. The sky had turned the color of old brass, and the roar of the flames had grown loud enough to make the horses dance nervously in their traces. Aunt Martha grabbed her husband's arm. "Thomas, please." But Thomas Morrison had not traveled 2,000 miles to be rescued by Indians. His pride was a physical thing, visible in the set of his jaw and the rigidity of his spine. "We stay with the wagon," he said. The warrior shrugged, a gesture that conveyed volumes about stubbornness and its consequences. He began to turn his horse away. Sarah made her choice in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She stood up in the wagon bed, causing both her aunt and uncle to turn toward her in surprise. "I'm going with them," she said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, calm and certain. "Uncle Thomas, I'm sorry, but I'm going." She did not wait for permission or argument. She climbed over the side of the wagon, her skirts catching on the rough wood, and dropped to the ground. The warrior watched her, his expression unreadable. When she stood before him, he extended his hand. Sarah hesitated only a moment before taking it. His grip was strong and calloused as he pulled her up behind him on his horse. She had never ridden astride, had certainly never been this close to a man who was nearly naked, but survival stripped away propriety faster than fire stripped grass from the prairie. Uncle Thomas shouted something, but his words were lost in the roar of the approaching flames. Aunt Martha was crying, reaching toward Sarah with desperate hands. The warrior spoke a single word to his horse, and they were moving. The other riders fell in around them, their formation swift and practiced. Sarah looked back once and saw the wagon, small and alone, with her aunt and uncle still sitting in the driver's seat. They grew smaller as the distance increased, and then the smoke swallowed them entirely. The warriors rode hard toward the rocky hills Sarah had seen earlier. The horse beneath her was powerful and sure-footed, navigating ground that would have broken the wagon wheels without slowing. Sarah held on to the warrior's waist because there was nothing else to hold, feeling the muscles of his back shift as he guided the horse. The heat was intense now, and when she dared to glance over her shoulder, she saw flames reaching into the sky like enormous orange hands. They reached the hills as the fire reached the place where the wagon had been. The warriors led the way into a narrow canyon where the rock walls rose high on both sides. At the far end, a spring fed a small pool of water. The horses drank gratefully while the men wet blankets and covered themselves and the animals. Sarah stood apart, shaking with reaction and grief, watching the prairie burn. Somewhere in that inferno were her aunt and uncle, and all that remained of her former life. The lead warrior approached her, carrying a wet blanket. He placed it over her shoulders without speaking, his touch surprisingly gentle. Their eyes met, and Sarah saw something in his gaze that she had not expected. Recognition, perhaps, of the cost of the choice she had made. He nodded once, a gesture of respect between equals, and then he was gone, attending to his men and horses, leaving Sarah alone with the weight of her survival. They traveled for 3 days before reaching the village. The warriors moved with purpose but without apparent hurry, following routes that Sarah could not identify, reading signs in the land that were invisible to her eyes. They gave her a horse of her own, a patient mare with kind eyes, and showed her how to sit properly. No one spoke English except the chief, and he said little beyond necessary instructions. At night, they made cold camps, eating dried meat and sleeping in the open. Sarah learned to accept the blanket she was given and to sleep despite the hardness of the ground and the strangeness of her companions. On the morning of the fourth day, they crested a rise, and Sarah saw the village spread below them in a wide valley. Dozens of teepees formed a circle beside a river, their pale hides glowing in the morning sun. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children played at the water's edge while women worked near the lodges. Dogs barked a warning as the riders descended, and people emerged to see who was coming. Sarah felt every eye upon her as they rode through the village. The warriors dispersed to their own families, leaving her alone with the chief. He dismounted and motioned for her to do the same. An older woman approached, her face lined with years but her movements strong and sure. She spoke to the chief in rapid Lakota, her tone questioning and sharp. He answered calmly, gesturing toward Sarah. The woman looked her up and down, then made a sound that might have been disapproval or simple acknowledgement. The chief spoke to Sarah in his careful English. "This is grandmother. She teach you." Before Sarah could ask what she was meant to learn, the old woman grabbed her wrist with surprising strength and pulled her toward one of the larger teepees. Sarah looked back at the chief, but he had already turned away, his attention claimed by warriors who needed to report and elders who wanted to speak with him. Inside the teepee, the grandmother pointed at Sarah's dress, making unmistakable gestures. Sarah understood. Her traveling dress, already torn and filthy from the journey, was unsuitable for this life. The old woman produced a soft leather dress decorated with quills and beads, clearly made for someone else but serviceable. She thrust it at Sarah and then turned her back, a concession to modesty that surprised Sarah more than anything else had. When Sarah emerged wearing the dress, several women had gathered. They examined her with frank curiosity, touching her hair, which was light brown and fine compared to their thick black braids. One young woman, perhaps Sarah's own age, smiled and spoke words that Sarah could not understand but recognized as friendly. Another woman laughed, not unkindly, and made adjustments to how Sarah wore the dress. The days developed a rhythm. Grandmother, whose real name Sarah learned was Winona, took charge of her education with the determination of a general conducting a campaign. She taught Sarah to gather wood properly, to prepare food, to cure hides and sew with sinew. She corrected mistakes with sharp words and occasional swats from her work-worn hands, but also nodded approval when Sarah got something right. The other women helped, demonstrating tasks with patience that transcended language barriers. Sarah learned that the chief's name was Mapia Wikapi, which meant cloud star, though the younger warriors called him Wikapi, or simply Star. She learned this from the young woman who had smiled at her that first day. Her name was Winyang Waste, beautiful woman, and she had a gift for making herself understood despite the language barrier. She spoke slowly, using gestures and simple words, and she laughed often at Sarah's mistakes in a way that made them seem less like failures and more like necessary steps toward understanding. Through Winyang Waste, Sarah began to grasp the structure of the village. Mapia Wikapi was not just a chief but the chief, the leader chosen by consensus for his wisdom, courage, and generosity. His decisions affected everyone, and his responsibility weighed visibly upon him. She saw him often, moving through the village, settling disputes, planning hunts, sitting with elders in council. He rarely looked at her directly, but Sarah felt his awareness of her presence nonetheless. One evening, perhaps 2 weeks after her arrival, Winona brought Sarah to the chief's fire. Several families gathered there, and for the first time, Sarah was included in a social gathering rather than simply being an object of curiosity or a student to be instructed. The talk flowed in Lakota, too rapid for her to follow, but the warmth was unmistakable. Children played nearby. Someone passed around a pipe. An old man told a story that made everyone laugh. Mapia Wikapi sat slightly apart, listening more than speaking. His presence commanded attention without demanding it. When he did speak, others quieted to hear him. Sarah found herself watching him, trying to reconcile her childhood stories of savage Indians with this man who seemed to carry the weight of his people's welfare with such steady strength. He caught her looking once, and for a moment, their eyes held. Sarah felt heat rise to her face and looked away quickly. Later, as the gathering broke up, Winona pulled Sarah aside. She pointed at the chief, then at Sarah, then made a gesture that clearly meant marriage. Sarah's eyes went wide. She shook her head emphatically, making her own gestures of refusal. Winona laughed, a sound like dried corn husks rustling, and patted Sarah's cheek. She spoke words that Sarah could not translate, but the meaning seemed to be something like "we shall see." That night, lying on the buffalo robes in Winona's teepee, Sarah could not sleep. She thought about her aunt and uncle, whom she had mourned and now rarely remembered. She thought about Philadelphia and her teaching position, about the life she had expected to live. That world seemed impossibly distant, as if it had belonged to someone else entirely. She thought about the prairie fire and the choice she had made, and she wondered if survival was enough or if she would need to find something more. Outside, a drum beat softly. Someone sang, the words carrying across the village in the darkness. Sarah listened to the alien melody and felt something shift inside her chest. Not quite belonging, not yet, but perhaps the possibility of it. She closed her eyes and let the sound carry her toward sleep, and in her dreams, she saw eagle feathers moving in the wind and eyes that held the weight of responsibility and something else she was not quite ready to name. The first snow came early, catching the village in the midst of harvest preparations. Sarah had learned to recognize the signs of changing seasons in the behavior of animals and the quality of light, but the sudden white blanket that covered the prairie still surprised her. She woke to find Winona already working, checking the teepee for gaps that would let in cold air, organizing supplies with the efficiency of someone who had survived many winters. The snowfall meant the buffalo hunt could not be delayed. The men prepared their weapons and horses while the women packed travel supplies. Sarah understood now that the hunt was not just about food but about survival. Everything the Lakota needed came from the buffalo: meat for eating, hides for shelter and clothing, bones for tools, sinew for sewing, even dried dung for fuel. Without a successful hunt, the village would face a hard winter. Mapia Wikapi led the preparations personally, checking every detail, speaking with each hunter. Sarah watched him from a distance, noting the way he moved among his people, the weight of leadership visible in every gesture. He was harder now than he had been, his face set in lines of concentration and concern. The responsibility for the village's survival rested on his shoulders, and he bore it with grim determination. The hunting party left at dawn. The women began the work that would occupy them until the men returned, making pemmican from stored meat, repairing clothing and teepees, gathering the last herbs before winter buried everything. Sarah worked alongside them, her hands more skilled now than they had been weeks ago. Winyang Waste sang while they worked, teaching Sarah the words to songs about the buffalo and the cycle of seasons. On the third day, riders appeared on the horizon. The women rushed out to see, but Sarah knew immediately from their posture that something was wrong. The hunting party returned with only 3 buffalo, barely enough to sustain the village through the coming months. Worse, 2 men had been injured in a stampede. One had a broken leg, the other a gash across his ribs that bled through the makeshift bandages. Mapia Wikapi looked like he had aged 10 years. He supervised the unloading of the kill, organized care for the injured, and then retreated to his teepee alone. Sarah learned from Winyang Waste that this was not just bad luck but a potential catastrophe. Other villages were struggling too. Game was scarce. The treaties the white men had forced upon the Lakota restricted where they could hunt. The buffalo herds that had once darkened the plains were growing smaller each year. That night, Sarah heard raised voices from the council fire. She could not understand the words, but the anger and fear needed no translation. Some wanted to hunt farther west, into territory claimed by traditional enemies. Others argued for raiding parties to take horses and supplies from white settlements. The debate raged for hours, and when it finally ended, no decision had been reached. Sarah found Mapia Wikapi the next morning sitting alone on a ridge overlooking the village. She had not planned to approach him, had not planned anything, but her feet carried her up the slope before she could question the impulse. He did not turn as she approached, but he did not send her away either. She sat beside him, leaving respectful distance between them, and looked out over the valley as he did. They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, he spoke in his careful English. "You understand our words now?" It was not a question. Sarah had not realized how much Lakota she had absorbed through weeks of immersion, but she found she could follow simple conversations and understand more than she could speak. She nodded. Mapia Wikapi continued, "Then you understand we are dying." The boldness of the statement shocked her. "Not dying," she said, struggling for words. "Struggling. There is difference." He turned to look at her then, really look at her, and Sarah saw the depth of exhaustion in his eyes. "You do not know," he said. "You see one village, one season. I see what comes. White men want land. They make promises, break promises. They kill buffalo for sport, leave bodies to rot. They bring sickness, whiskey, guns. We fight, we die. We make peace, we die slower." Sarah had no answer for that. She had seen the wagon trains, had heard her uncle talk about manifest destiny and civilizing the wilderness. She had never questioned the rightness of Western expansion, had never considered the cost paid by those who were already here. The knowledge sat heavy in her chest. "What will you do?" she asked quietly. Mapia Wikapi was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he would not answer. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I do not know. This is why I am poor chief. Good chief has answers." Sarah felt a surge of anger on his behalf. "Good chief cares for his people," she said. "You do that. Rest is just being human." He turned to her again, and this time, something had changed in his expression. The walls he kept between himself and others had shifted slightly, allowing her a glimpse of the man beneath the responsibility. "You are a strange woman," he said. "Not afraid like you should be. Not hate like others of your people. Why you stay?" Sarah considered the question seriously. She could have said she stayed because she had nowhere else to go, which was true but not the whole truth. She could have said she stayed because Winona and the other women had shown her kindness, which was also true. Instead, she said simply, "Because I am learning what it means to be human." Something passed between them in that moment, a connection that transcended language and culture and the vast differences in their experiences. Mapia Wikapi reached out slowly, giving her time to move away if she wished. When she did not, he touched her face gently, his rough fingers tracing the line of her cheekbone. "You understand now," he said. "Fire brought you here. Fire takes everything, but also makes new growth possible." The touch lasted only a moment before he withdrew his hand and stood. "Come," he said. "Work to do." But as they walked back down to the village together, Sarah felt that something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer a rescued stranger or a curiosity to be managed. She had become, in some way she could not fully articulate, a part of the fabric of this place and these people. And Mapia Wikapi, the chief who carried his people's survival on his shoulders, had allowed her to see his humanity. Winter settled over the prairie with a grip of iron and ice. The village drew inward, families gathering in teepees around fires that fought back the cold. Food was rationed carefully, but the shadow of hunger haunted everyone. Sarah learned what it meant to go to bed with a belly that was never quite full, to wake with cold that seeped through every layer, to wonder if spring would come before the supplies ran out. But she also learned other things. She learned the stories told around winter fires, tales of Ictomy the trickster and white buffalo calf woman, stories that carried the history and wisdom of the Lakota people. She learned the songs that women sang while working, melodies that transformed tedious tasks into something like prayer. She learned that laughter could exist alongside hardship, that joy did not require ease, that community was built in the daily acts of sharing and supporting one another. Mapia Wikapi sought her out more often now. Their conversations happened in a mixture of Lakota and English, each teaching the other, filling gaps in understanding with gestures and patience. He told her about his childhood, about the days when buffalo herds stretched farther than eyes could see, when his people moved freely across the plains, following the seasons and the game. She told him about Philadelphia, about books and schools, about a world he found as alien as she had once found his. One night, as the wind howled outside Winona's teepee, the old woman turned to Sarah with unusual seriousness. She spoke in Lakota, slowly enough for Sarah to follow. "The chief has spoken to me. He wants you for his wife. I told him to ask you himself, but he says words are hard. So I ask. What do you say?" Sarah's breath caught. She had known, somehow, that this moment was coming, but knowing did not make it easier. Marriage to Mapia Wikapi would make her fully Lakota in the eyes of the village. It would close the door forever on her old life, on any possibility of returning to the white world. But that door had been closing since the moment she climbed onto his horse and let him carry her away from the fire. "I need to speak with him," Sarah said. Winona nodded, unsurprised, and gestured toward the teepee entrance. Sarah wrapped her buffalo robe around her shoulders and stepped out into the bitter night. The chief's teepee glowed with firelight. She stood outside, gathering courage, and then called his name softly. He answered immediately, inviting her in. Inside, the fire cast dancing shadows on the hide walls. Mapia Wikapi sat on buffalo robes, his face serious but open. He gestured for her to sit. Sarah settled across from him, the fire between them, and for a moment, neither spoke. Finally, he said in English, "You know why you are here." "Winona told me," Sarah said. "But I need to understand." "Why me?" "You could marry anyone in the village. Someone who belongs here, who knows your ways, who would not be burden to you." Mapia Wikapi shook his head. "You are not burden. You are gift from fire. You have courage. You learn. You do not pity us or hate us. You see us as human beings. This is rare thing. But I am white, Sarah said, voicing the fear that lived beneath all her other fears. Your people are dying because of my people. How can you want to bind yourself to that? His expression grew sad. My people are dying because world is changing. You did not cause this. You cannot stop this. But you choose to stand with us, to learn our ways, to share our struggle. This means something. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. I am afraid, she whispered. Afraid I will fail you. Afraid I will never truly belong. Afraid of what this means. Mapia Wikapi moved around the fire to sit beside her. He took her hand in both of his. Fear is good. Fear means you understand weight of choice. But fear cannot be reason to turn away from life. Fire taught you this. You chose life over fear once. Choose again now. She looked at their joined hands, his dark and scarred from years of fighting and hunting, hers pale and marked now with the work of survival. Two different worlds, meeting in this moment. If I say yes, she asked, what happens to woman you are now? To Sarah Morrison from Philadelphia. His answer was simple and profound. She becomes who she was always meant to be. The ceremony was small, held 3 days later in the chief's teepee with Winona and the elders present. Sarah wore a white doeskin dress that had taken the women of the village countless hours to prepare, each bead and quill representing prayers for her happiness and fertility. Mapia Wikapi wore his finest clothing, the 2 eagle feathers in his hair marking him as a chief and warrior of honor. They spoke vows in both Lakota and English, promising to honor and care for each other, to share burdens and joys, to build a life together. That night, lying beside her husband in the darkness, Sarah felt the weight of her transformation. She was no longer the school teacher from Philadelphia. She was no longer simply the white woman the chief had rescued from the prairie fire. She was Mapia Wikapi's wife, a member of the Lakota Nation, a woman who had chosen one life over another and would live with that choice for whatever time remained. Spring came slowly, breaking winter's grip one cold day at a time. The village survived, though barely, and with the warming weather came new hope. Hunters went out and returned with game. Women planted small gardens in sheltered spots. Children played in the mud and sunshine, their laughter a sound of pure resilience. Sarah worked alongside the other women, her hands quick now, her understanding deep. Winyang Waste teased her about how well she had adapted, calling her Wakanyejiska, white child, with affection rather than mockery. One evening, as the sun painted the prairie gold and orange, Mapia Wikapi took Sarah's hand and led her to the ridge where they had sat months before. The valley spread below them, the village small and vulnerable against the vastness of the land. I have been thinking, he said, about what you said. About dying and struggling. You were right. We are not dying. We are transforming, like butterfly, like seasons. Some of us will be lost. But some will remain, will carry forward what matters. He turned to her, taking both her hands. You are part of what remains. Our children will carry both worlds in their blood. They will know our stories in your language. They will walk between, and maybe that is gift, not curse. Sarah leaned into him, feeling the strength of his body and the steadiness of his heart. I was looking for safety, she said quietly. I found it in the last place I expected. But I found more than safety. I found home. The sun set, painting the sky in shades of fire, and Sarah understood that she had been wrong about something fundamental. She had thought the prairie fire had destroyed her old life, leaving her no choice but to build a new one. But fire, as Mapia Wikapi had told her, did not just destroy. It cleared away the dead growth, made room for new seeds, enriched the soil with ash. The woman she had been had needed to burn away so the woman she was becoming could emerge. She thought of her aunt and uncle, gone to ash in the flames. She thought of the Philadelphia schoolroom and the banker's clerk who would have made a suitable husband. She thought of all the versions of herself she had left behind. And then she let those thoughts go, released them into the wind that swept across the prairie, carrying away the past to make room for the future. Here, in this place, with this man and these people, she had found something her old life could never have given her. The knowledge that safety was not about avoiding danger but about facing it with courage, that home was not a place but a choice renewed each day, and that love could grow in the most unexpected soil, tough and beautiful as prairie grass, rooted deep enough to survive any storm.